The content on the Unitails channel is protected by copyright. Unauthorized use may result in legal liability. A bet on life, I dialed Victoria's number for the 10th time, but all I got in return were short, empty beeps. That was odd. She never ignored my calls, especially when I was away on a business trip. My jaw tightened as unease crawled up my spine. All right, maybe her phone had died. I switched to my daughter's number, Sophia. Her bright, cheerful voice usually lifted my spirits instantly, but now silence. The number was unreachable. This was no longer just odd. This was a warning sign. I glanced down at my darkened phone screen and made my decision. To hell with my scheduled flight in 3 days. I was getting on the first plane home. The house greeted me with an unsettling silence. The lights were on, but there was no sign of Victoria or Sophia. A sharp, cold sensation twisted in my chest. I pushed open the front gate, and that's when my instinct screamed. The lock had been broken. Soundlessly, I pulled a knife from my jacket pocket and eased the front door open without a sound. The living room was a disaster. Drawers overturned, papers scattered across the floor, shattered glass from a broken vase glinting under the dim light. And then I saw them. 2 men rifling through the cabinets, tossing documents aside. Another one, facing away from me, was shoving the couch aside, searching for something underneath. I didn't give them time to react. The first hit was swift, brutal, a sharp blow to the jaw. His head snapped back, and he crumpled to the floor like a sack of bricks. The second man turned, but I'd already grabbed him by the collar, slamming him into the wall so hard he choked on his own breath. The third one reached for his gun. Too slow. I drove my elbow into his throat. He gagged, doubling over, but before I could finish him, I heard a faint hiss. Something sharp pierced my neck. I reached up, fingers fumbling for the dart, but my hands refused to obey. The world blurred, my legs gave out. I stumbled forward, collapsing to my knees. The last thing I heard before darkness swallowed me was a mocking voice. Time to rest, hero. A jackhammer pounded inside my skull. I pried my eyes open, blinking against the dim, flickering light of a single bulb swinging from a low ceiling. The air was damp, thick with the stench of mildew and old concrete. I tried to move, cold steel bit into my wrists. Handcuffs, chained to a thick metal pipe. Awake at last. The voice came from across the room. A man sat leisurely in a chair, swirling a glass of amber liquid. Mid-40s, well-groomed, wearing an expensive suit, but the sneer on his face ruined any pretense of sophistication. Alex, right? A pleasure. He smirked. Daniel Harris, owner of the King's Underground Casino. I'm sure you'd know how you got here. I clenched my jaw, glaring at him in silence. All right, let's not drag it out. He took a slow sip of whiskey, savoring the taste. Your wife, Victoria, is quite the woman. Fiery, loves to have fun. She came to my casino with her little plaything, Winston, a lousy gambler, a filthy rich bastard. Honestly, at first, I thought he was your business partner, or at least her lover. The way they were all over each other at the bar, I started to wonder if you even existed. My insides turned to ice, but I didn't say a word. They drank, they played. Winston lost big. But Victoria? Oh, she was something else. She didn't want to stop. He chuckled, watching my face. And when she ran out of money, guess what she bet? A slow pause, drawing out the moment. She bet your house. My fingers curled into fists. The cuffs cut into my skin, but I barely felt it. Did she lose? I rasped, though I already knew the answer. Of course she did. Harris leaned in, his grin widening. But here's the fun part. When she lost the house, I gave her an option to walk away. But your wife? She's special. She wanted to win it all back. My teeth ground together, so hard my jaw ached. And do you know what she bet next? Harris watched me, savoring the moment. She bet your daughter. Something inside me exploded. A white-hot, merciless rage. I lunged forward, but the chains held me back. The cuffs tore into my wrists as I strained against them. Harris just laughed, delighted by my fury. God, Alex, I love this part. He exclaimed, eyes gleaming. That look, that agony on your face. Yes, Victoria bet Sophia. She thought luck was finally on her side. But, you know, luck's a fickle bitch. She lost again. My blood turned to ice. Where's my daughter? My voice was low, deadly. Harris leaned back, placing his glass on a wooden crate, fingers laced together. She's already been taken. Sophia will work off her mother's debt. My clients are rich, respectable men. She's young, fresh. The demand will be high. A sound tore from my throat, something primal, inhuman. Every muscle in my body locked, every nerve screaming for violence. I will kill you, I whispered, my voice shaking with fury. Harris only smirked and stood up, strolling over to me. Oh, I have no doubt, he murmured. You're strong, smart, dangerous. But there's a problem. He crouched, looking me dead in the eyes. You owe me now, too. I forced my fist to unclench. My mind sharpened through the haze of fury. You won't kill me, I said through gritted teeth. Oh, Alex. Harris laughed, patting my cheek. I already have. He straightened, lazily adjusting his cufflinks. But I'm a reasonable man, he continued. So here's the deal. You pay me what your wife lost, and we part ways. Or, he let the silence stretch. Or what? I bit out. Or you suffer a little, he said with a grin. My guys are good at their job. Trust me, by the time we're done, you'll pay me every last cent. Just without a few teeth. Maybe a couple of fingers. I forced my breathing to slow, to calm. Harris thought he had already won. In his eyes, I was a beaten man. He leaned in one last time, his breath reeking of whiskey and cigars. What do you say, Alex? He asked, tilting his head like a predator toying with prey. I looked him dead in the eyes. Go to hell. Harris sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. Then he turned to his men. Have fun with him, but don't go too far. I still need him breathing. He adjusted his suit and strolled toward the door, buttoning his jacket. I have business to attend to, he called over his shoulder. Alex, enjoy our hospitality. The door clicked shut behind him. A thick-fingered goon cracked his knuckles. So, hero, he sneered, stepping closer. Shall we begin? The second man slipped on a brass knuckle, smacking it against his palm. I tightened my fists. This would hurt, but if I got out of here, none of them would live to regret it. The brute with the brass knuckles smirked, raising his fist, clearly savoring the sight of me chained to the pipe. Helpless, doomed. I had seen that look 1,000 times before. The smug confidence of a butcher who had grown used to slaughtering bound cattle. He struck me in the stomach, putting all his dumb strength into the blow. The air rushed from my lungs, but I didn't make a sound. Well, tough guy, he sneered, shaking his wrist as if checking if it was still intact. I looked at him, tilting my head slightly, as if studying a pathetic cockroach. Are you serious? I rasped. I've made coffee with more pain than that. You son of a, he hissed, swinging again, this time aiming for my face. My lips split, the taste of blood pooling on my tongue. And inside me, something clicked into place like an old switch being flipped. The scent of blood, sharp, metallic, triggered a memory. Captivity. I had been captured before. Not here, but in Bogota, Colombia, back when I was working as a U.S. Special Operations operative. We had been tracking a cartel boss, but something went wrong. I was taken, had 2 fingers broken, my nose shattered, tortured with electricity as they tried to extract useful intel. What they didn't understand was that I hadn't just been trained to endure pain. I had been trained to embrace it. Now this dumb bastard with his brass knuckles reminded me of one of those Colombians. The only difference was back then they had tied me to a chair. This time it was a pipe. Chairs. I had already broken those before. The brute swung again, but I shifted my head just enough for the punch to miss. He stumbled forward, and I yanked upward on the cuffs with all the strength I had calculated. The old metal groaned, but held. A second punch slammed into my stomach. Another rush of air left my lungs, but I only smirked. Well, damn, I croaked, lifting my head. That all you got? You little... He raised his fist again. I jerked my body once more. This time, the pipe cracked louder. I felt the metal give way. The brute swung again, but I already knew what to do. At the last second, I yanked both hands downward, and the pipe finally ripped free from its mountings. With a handful of rusted steel still attached to my cuffs, I lunged forward. The jagged end of the pipe smashed into his temple with a dull crunch. He twitched, then crumpled to the side, his legs kicking spasmodically. The second guy lunged at me with a knife. I adjusted my grip on the pipe and slammed it into his knee. A distinct crack echoed, like a dry branch snapping underfoot. He screamed, dropping to one knee. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I grabbed his head and drove it into the wall. Once, twice, 3 times. By the third, his body went limp. Breathing heavily, I tasted blood on my lips. The basement was silent. I stood, shaking off the remnants of the handcuffs, then wiped my face with the back of my hand. I had a goal now. Find Sophia and kill every single one of them in my way. A cold, calculating rage seeped through me. The basement still smelled of blood, rusted iron, and damp decay, but I no longer noticed. The brutes on the floor were either dead or close to it. I scanned the room. At the far end stood an old metal door, locked from the inside with a bolt. The moment I had ripped the pipe from its fittings, I knew it might come in handy again. I shoved the rusted steel into the gap between the bolt and the door, then pulled hard. The lock gave with a screech of tortured metal. Beyond the door stretched a long, narrow corridor, dimly lit by flickering bulbs on the ceiling. The floor was slick with something thick, maybe water mixed with oil, or maybe the blood of those who had come here before me and never left. I moved forward, gripping the pipe. My pulse pounded in my ears. A voice. You hear that? 2 men, one with a shotgun, the other with a crowbar. Both looked relaxed, not expecting their prey to fight back. They never got the chance. I burst from the corner, ducking under the shotgun's barrel while ramming the pipe into the throat of the closest man. He gurgled as I twisted the steel, cartilage snapping under the pressure. The second guy hesitated. That was all I needed. I grabbed him by the neck, drove my forehead into his face, feeling his nose shatter, then yanked him by the hair and slammed his head into the wall. Blood splattered across the grimy concrete. I let the pipe clatter to the floor and grabbed his crowbar instead. Then I kept moving. The corridor opened into a large room, a casino. Not the flashy kind from Vegas. This was a filthy, smoke-filled pit with low ceilings, greasy faces, and cheap playing cards scattered across stained tables. People were everywhere, gamblers, whores, guards. The moment I stepped into the room, everything froze. I stood there covered in blood, gripping a crowbar, breathing hard. The first guard reached for his gun. I hurled the crowbar. It struck his chest with a hollow thud. Chaos erupted. People screamed. Some ran for the exit. Others froze like deer in headlights. I wasn't here for them. I saw the guard with an assault rifle by the far door. I moved. He fired, missed. I was already on him, grabbing the barrel, twisting it, forcing his finger against the trigger. A burst of bullets shredded his chest. Blood sprayed across the door. The rifle fit comfortably in my hands. And then, everything blurred into a furious, blood-soaked storm. I moved like a predator among sheep, methodically eliminating anyone who raised a weapon. One burst, one body fell. A rifle butt to the skull, another down. A shot to the gut, one more writhing on the floor, but I didn't stop. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. The guards fought back, but it was useless. I was faster, meaner, more experienced. Only when the room was filled with corpses and groaning bodies did I hear it. Doors slamming shut. Harris, the bastard, was running. I bolted after him, but through the glass doors, I saw his black Audi peel away, kicking up dust. He understood. He understood he had made a mistake. But it didn't matter. I was coming for him, and his death would be slow. I wiped my bloody hand on a dead guard's shirt, picking up an extra magazine from his vest. The air reeked of gunpowder, sweat, and cheap whiskey. The casino was now a slaughterhouse. Tables overturned, glass shattered, dark pools spreading across the floor, reflecting the flickering light. A girl in a short dress was sobbing in the corner, pressing herself against the wall, hands over her face. I didn't even look at her. My target was Harris. I stepped over the dead and walked toward the exit. Outside, the asphalt still held the day's heat, though the night air was growing cooler. I scanned left, right, no sign of the Audi. Near the entrance, one of the guards was still alive, wounded, crawling. He tried to drag himself away, leaving a crimson trail. I planted my boot on his chest, pinning him down. Where did he go? What? He wheezed, his bloody hands clutching at my pant leg. I don't know. I pressed down harder. You have 10 seconds to remember, or you'll watch your own ribs cave in. Okay. He coughed blood. He said something about the hangar, the port. He's got a boat. A boat. He was running to the water. I lifted my foot, but before he could take another breath, I leaned in close. How many men are there? I don't know for sure. He exhaled weakly. Usually 15, maybe more. I gave a silent nod, stood up, and walked toward the nearest car, a Chevrolet, with the keys still hanging in the ignition. Looked like one of the casino's patrons had been in such a hurry to flee that they forgot all about it. I was just about to get behind the wheel when I heard a weak voice behind me. Hey, I turned around. The guard was looking up at me, his eyes darting around as if he were debating whether to speak at all. You're not going to leave them, are you? Leave who? The girls, he swallowed hard. Harris keeps them at the port. Your daughter and the others. My blood boiled. I stepped toward him, crouching down so I could look straight into his shifty, desperate eyes. If anything has happened to my daughter, I said in a calm, cold voice, I'll be back. He gave a frantic nod, and I wasted no more time on him. I jumped into the Chevrolet, turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. In the rearview mirror, the casino slowly faded into darkness. But Harris's personal hell was only just beginning. The engine hummed steadily, like a drunk after a bottle of cheap whiskey. I gripped the wheel, eyes locked on the dark road ahead as I sped toward the port. Adrenaline still pounded in my temples, my fingers white from the pressure. 15 men, maybe more. I wasn't against uneven fights, but being realistic was a useful skill, especially when my daughter's life was on the line. I swerved right and pulled up outside a roadside bar. A cheap joint with neon signs, reeking of booze, greasy snacks, and crushed dreams. This was where I'd find the one man who might come in handy. I stepped out of the car, rolled my shoulders, cracked my neck, and pushed the door open. Inside, dim lighting, a handful of drunks, a bartender who looked like he had been born behind that counter, his face etched with a single philosophy: I don't give a shit. And there he was. At the far end of the bar sat Joe the nail baker. Former demolition expert, former thug, former decent human being. Now, just a fat bastard who drank himself into oblivion on someone else's dime. But when it came to explosives and shootouts, no one was better. Alex, Joe squinted, raising his bottle. Well, I'll be damned. That really you? Get up, Nail. Time to remember why God gave you hands. He snorted and took another swig from the bottle. Man, I could do a lot of things with my hands, but something tells me you're not talking about what I'm thinking. I need guns, explosives, and your fat ass in my car in 5 minutes. Joe lazily reached for a bowl of peanuts, tossed a handful into his mouth, and chewed slowly. How about 10? I still got beer left. I grabbed his bottle and poured the rest onto his lap. Time's up. He glanced at me, then down at his soaked jeans, then back at me. Alex, you're a goddamn lunatic. And you're just now figuring that out? He let out a heavy sigh, stood up, and cracked his neck. Well, shit. Let's go. Hope this is at least fun. Oh, Joe. I smirked, opening the door for him. This is going to be a goddamn party. The port. The night air was thick with salt, oil, and despair. In the distance, a cargo ship groaned as it lifted containers, but my focus was on an old warehouse by the water. That's where they were keeping Sophia. I drew my gun. Joe, on the other hand, carried his favorite toy, a homemade explosive the size of a soccer ball. We going in quiet or the old-fashioned way? He asked, grinning as he eyed the building. We keep a balance, I said, chambering around. Half of them go quietly, the other half, not so much. Damn, I love your style. Joe chuckled and moved forward. I followed, jaw clenched. I knew one thing. If even one of those bastards had laid a hand on Sophia, I would turn this place into hell itself. Joe and I crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, watching the warehouse. Guards milled around, definitely not the kind that fought fair. One was lazily smoking near the entrance, another was glued to his phone, and a third, well, he was scratching his balls like he had no shame whatsoever. Jesus, real professionals, Joe muttered. Look at that one. Scratching his head, scratching his balls. Bet he's contemplating world peace. The only fate he should be contemplating is a bullet. I checked my magazine and nodded. You ready? Joe smirked, pulling a metal sphere from his backpack. Always. You clear the way, I add the fireworks. I didn't bother asking exactly how many fireworks he had in mind. We moved in. First one down. I slipped from behind the container and drove my knife into the smoker's side. He jerked, exhaling smoke through his nose like a dragon whose fuel line had just been cut. You know? I murmured into his ear as he sagged. They say smoking kills. He let out a strangled gasp before collapsing, staining the oily concrete. Second one. The guy with the phone didn't even see me coming. I snatched his phone mid-scroll, glanced at the screen. You serious? I asked. What? He stammered, going pale. Dream Farm? Level 35? Man, are you a gangster or a goddamn farmer? His mouth opened, but he never got the chance to reply. The butt of my pistol introduced itself to his jaw, and he dropped like a sack of potatoes. Sweet dreams, cowboy, I muttered, stepping over him. Third one. The ball scratcher finally realized something was wrong. Hey, who the hell? He shouted, fumbling for his gun. I flicked the dead guy's cigarette, but at him. It hit his face, and he coughed in surprise, just enough of a delay for me to close the distance. You seem to be short on hands, I murmured as I twisted his wrist. The crack was loud enough for Joe to hear. Phew, the guy screamed. I swiftly introduced his forehead to the shipping container. Once. Twice. Damn, Joe chuckled, stepping around us, eyeing the blood smeared on the rusted metal. Someone told me this guy had a hard head. Not anymore, I muttered, snatching the guy's radio. A voice crackled through the speaker. Everything all right? I pressed the button, mimicking his voice. Yeah, all good. I just tripped. You dumbass. What the hell's wrong with you? I hit the button again. Well, not gonna argue with that. Then I turned the radio off. Joe snorted. This is why I love you, Alex. I know, but we're not getting married. I nodded toward the warehouse. It's time. We stepped forward, leaving bodies in our wake. Harris thought he could play this game with me. Soon, he learned just how wrong he was. We approached the massive warehouse gates, the muffled murmur of voices leaking from within. They were in there, the ones who held my daughter, the ones who thought they could take what was most precious to me and walk away unpunished. I gripped my gun so tightly my knuckles turned white, but it didn't stop the trembling in my fingers. Not from fear, from rage. Pure, seeding, all-consuming hatred. I swung the butt of my rifle against the control panel, forcing the gates to grind open. Light flooded out, but I didn't flinch. Inside they stood, at least a dozen armed bastards. Some gawked at me, frozen mid-motion. Others were already scrambling for their guns. The hell? One of them shouted, clutching at his shotgun. I raised my Beretta and put a bullet in his face. His skull exploded like an overripe watermelon, spraying blood and bone onto his nearest friends. He didn't even get the chance to scream, just collapsed backward, knocking over a metal chair as he fell. The rest erupted into chaos. Two fired at me, but I'd already dropped to one knee, rolling to the side and pressing against the wall. Joe flanked them from another angle, flashing his favorite knife, a long, serrated monster that looked more like a compact machete. Well, boys, who's first? He roared, charging forward. I slipped back into the open, gripping my pistol with both hands, and fired at the one scrambling for cover behind a stack of crates. The bullet tore into his thigh, and he shrieked like a pig being skinned alive. I lunged at him, drove my boot into his wounded leg, heard the bone snap, and pressed the gun's muzzle to his forehead. Where's my daughter? I shot him in the knee. He howled, his eyes rolling back in agony, writhing like a fish dumped on a dry land. The next one goes in your mouth if you don't start talking. In the room back of the warehouse guards, I didn't let him finish. A bullet to the head ended his suffering. Meanwhile, Joe was enjoying himself with another one of them. The poor bastard tried to fight back, but his strikes were useless. Joe sidestepped, slashed through the tendons in his leg, and dropped him to his knees. Then, without hesitation, he slit his throat. Damn, that one was juicy. Joe grinned, flicking the blood off his blade. I didn't answer. I was already moving. The last two tried to flee down the corridor leading to the back of the warehouse. One even dropped his weapon, realizing he had no chance of survival. But I wasn't in the mood to let witnesses walk away. I picked up an assault rifle from a corpse and unleashed a long burst into their backs. They stumbled. One collapsed instantly, convulsing on the floor. The other managed a few more desperate steps before his knees buckled and he landed face first in a pool of his own blood. They didn't deserve a quick death, but I didn't have time to make them suffer. I sprinted to the door where, according to that dead bastard, they were keeping Sophia and kicked it open. The room was small. A filthy bed, a broken chair, a dim lamp flickering in the corner. And in the middle of it all, bound to a chair, her mouth taped shut, Sophia. I rushed to her, tearing the tape from her lips. "Dad," she whispered, her wide eyes brimming with terror. That fear made my rage boil over. With a single motion, I cut through the ropes binding her wrists and cupped her face in my hands. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here." They said they were going to sell me. I closed my eyes, struggling to contain the inferno roaring inside me. They won't be saying anything to anyone ever again. I stood gun in hand. "Where's Harris?" Sophia, her hands still trembling, pointed to a door at the side of the room. "He ran that way. He knew you'd come." I lifted my head, my heartbeat steady, my pulse slowing. Harris knew. He understood he had messed with the wrong man, but he had no idea just how badly. "Joe, take her outside," I ordered, reloading my rifle. "Where the hell are you going?" I stepped toward the door, leading into the dark corridor. To close this goddamn deal. And then the hunt began. I moved through the hallway like death itself, slow, deliberate, without hesitation. Harris was running, scrambling for his life, but I could hear him. I heard his panicked footsteps ahead, heard doors slamming as he tried to throw obstacles in my way, heard him stumble, curse under his breath. He knew I was coming, and he knew that stopping meant dying. I reached the final room just as the door slammed shut. I kicked at it, but Harris had already shoved a steel bar across the other side. I inhaled slowly, exhaled. "Daniel," I called softly, rapping my knuckles against the wood. Silence. "Daniel, we both know you're in there." "Go to hell," his voice cracked. Gone was the cocky arrogance he had flaunted back in the basement. Now, there was only fear. Sticky, suffocating fear. "You know what your problem is?" I continued, idly spinning my knife in my palm. "You picked the wrong target. You thought you could take my daughter. Thought you could break me like some worthless insect." "I didn't know," he wailed. "I didn't know she was your daughter. It was Victoria. She bet her. I'm just a businessman, Alex. It was never personal." I chuckled. "Oh, Danny, that's where you're wrong again." I raised my rifle and fired 2 short bursts into the door's hinges. Harris screamed as the door crashed onto the floor. He was standing in the middle of a tiny office, the desk overturned as if it would protect him. A gun trembled in his hands, but they were shaking so badly that even a 90-year-old with arthritis would shoot straighter. I stepped forward, aiming my rifle at his face. "Well, go ahead. Shoot. Jay, just walk away." "Alex," Harris backed into the wall. "We can make a deal." I lowered my weapon slightly. "A deal? That's an interesting idea." I paused as if considering. "And what kind of deal are we talking about?" "I'll give you money." Harris nodded frantically. $1 million. 2. Whatever you want. Just let me go. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." I smiled. "You're right about one thing. I'll never see you again." I lunged, knocked the gun from his hand, drove my fist into his gut. Harris doubled over, gasping, but I didn't let him fall. I grabbed a fistful of his hair and dragged him toward the exit. "And no, wait," he whimpered. "Let's talk." "Oh, Danny," I said with a grin. "We're going to talk. Later at the port." I found an old fishing plant. It had plenty of useful equipment for interesting conversations. Harris was strapped to a metal table, his mouth taped shut, his eyes darting frantically, searching for salvation that wasn't coming. I stood beside him, rolling up my sleeves. In front of me lay an assortment of tools, a hammer, a knife, bolt cutters, a blowtorch. I ripped the tape from his mouth. "Aya!" Harris screamed, but I silenced him with a punch to the teeth. "You know what's funny?" I asked calmly. "I spent a long time deciding what to do with you. Shoot out your knees? Break every bone in your body? You don't have to do this, he shrieked. You have honor. I grabbed his pinky and forced it into the bolt cutters. I was a soldier. I've seen children murdered. I've seen the innocent taken. But there's one thing I've never forgotten. You know what that is? Harris swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes. No one walks away from this kind of shit without consequences. I clenched the cutters. His fingers snapped off. He howled, his body arching. But I was already moving, methodically severing each joint with every sob and plea he let out. This one's for Sophia. I lopped off another finger. And this is for Victoria. Not because I give a damn about her, but because you started all this because of her. Harris choked on his breath, his sweat dripping onto the cold metal. And this, I picked up the knife, dragging it slowly across his forehead, leaving a thin red line. This is for thinking I was just like all your other victims. Please, he whimpered. Oh, now it's please. I shook my head, mockingly. When you stood over me in that basement, you didn't ask if I wanted any of it, did you? I grabbed his hand and drove a nail straight between the bones in his palm, feeling them crack under the pressure. Harris convulsed, letting out a guttural wail. I stepped to the table, picked up the blowtorch, and ignited it. The flame flared to life with a soft, menacing hiss. Harris shook his head frantically. And no, please, please. I nodded. All right. I lowered the fire to his skin. The scream he let out was music. I took my time, searing every inch of his palms, every line, every vein. Harris writhed, but the cuffs held him tight. When he could no longer scream, when his voice had withered into a rasp, I lifted his head by the hair. Remember, Danny, your mistake wasn't playing with fire. Your mistake was thinking I'd burn. I raised my knife and drove it straight into his heart. He twitched. His eyes froze. Then slowly they went glassy. I ripped the blade free, wiped it clean on his shirt, and let out a slow breath. This is the real end. The door was locked from the outside, but not very well. One good slam of my rifle butt, and the lock broke like a cheap knockoff. Inside, the stench was thick, fear, sweat, and hopelessness. Girls, some barely teenagers, others young women, sat huddled on dirty mattresses, curled into the corners like animals that had long since learned the pain of beating. Some sobbed, some just stared blankly, having already accepted their fate. But tonight, their fate was changing. Hey, I called out. A few heads lifted. We're leaving. All of you. We led them outside, helping the ones who could barely stand. Joe was already by Sophia, who clung to his sleeve as he whispered something to distract her from everything she had just survived. The moment she saw me, she let go of him and ran, clutching my arm. Dad, is it really over? Her voice was weak, but the fear was gone. I brushed a hand through her hair, looked in her eyes, and answered firmly, Yes, sweetheart. Now we're going to make sure this place disappears forever. I turned to Joe, who was lazily spinning a detonator in his hand with a smirk. Was going to say something profound, but screw it. He shrugged and pressed the button. The explosion tore through the night. The warehouse erupted. The blast so powerful, even the ocean seemed to recoil, as if it wanted no part in what had happened here. Flames devoured the roof. Walls collapsed like a house of cards, and a black column of smoke twisted into the sky, carrying away the ashes of this place's sins. We stood on the pier, watching as the lair of those bastards disappeared for good. Sophia gripped my hand tighter. Dad, it'll never come back, right? I looked down at her, and for the first time all night smiled. No, baby. It burned to the ground. Joe stepped beside me, shoving a whiskey bottle into my hand. Well, to victory. I uncapped it, took a long drink, then handed it back. To a new dawn. We stood in silence, watching the last embers consume that cursed place. And just like that, a new chapter of our lives began. I thought the hardest part was over. I had pulled Sophia from hell, killed Harris, wiped his den off the map, and destroyed everyone who had served him. But there was still one thing left to do. Victoria, my wife, the woman I had spent 20 years with, the mother of my daughter, the woman who had gambled away our home without a second thought, who had lost our child and hadn't even flinched. I remembered when I had once loved her. I remembered the day we met, She worked at a cafe near the beach, and I had just returned from my first deployment. Back then, I thought I'd found the one person I'd spend my whole life with. She was fun, smart, caring. We built a family together. I worked. She raised Sophia. We laughed, had picnics, traveled, and I had been a fool. I didn't see when she started to change, when she grew colder, when her gaze turned empty. I ignored the late nights, the meetings that ran long. I believed her, and now this was how it ended. I found her. Ocean Front Villa. Victoria never cared for modesty. Even after I retired, I still had enough connections to keep an eye on the money flowing into our family. But it seemed she had found another source of income lately. A white, two-story house with panoramic windows, a pool, and a view of the ocean. She was still playing the role of the rich woman, still thinking the world was hers. She in there? Joe asked, sitting beside me in the car, picking his teeth with a knife. She is. And so is he, I said, glancing at the parking lot. A red Mercedes. The license plate was familiar. I'd seen it before. Winston, the bastard she had been screwing. You want this loud or elegant? Joe asked, watching me with interest. I smirked. Oh, I want them to feel like they're back at the casino. They loved gambling so much, after all. We stepped out of the car and headed for the house. I didn't knock. I just kicked the door open, sending it crashing against the wall. Inside, there were two of them. Victoria, lounging in a silk robe, a glass of wine in her hand, her legs casually propped up on the table. Next to her, Winston, a well-groomed prick in an expensive suit. He shot to his feet the moment he saw me. Hey, Alex. Victoria dropped her glass. Red wine spilled across the table like blood. Hey, darling. I smiled, stepping inside. Glad to see you're not too stressed. What are you doing here? Her voice trembled. Well, I sat down in the chair across from them, folding my hands together. I thought I'd check in on my family. You're my wife, Victoria. Don't I have a right to know where you are? Winston swallowed hard, his hand creeping toward his phone. I wouldn't do that, Joe said, lazily drawing his gun and aiming it right at Winston's forehead. Or do you love taking risks as much as you did in the casino? Alex, Victoria shot up from the couch, but I lifted a hand, making her freeze. Sit, I said it calmly. She hesitated. Sit. She sank back onto the couch, pressing her lips together. What do you want? She mumbled. I laughed. What do I want? You're seriously asking me what I want. My smile vanished. You bet our daughter, Victoria. Our daughter. She turned away, trying to hide her face. I thought I could win it back. Win it back. I shot up, knocking my chair over. Was she just a goddamn poker chip to you? I didn't know they would actually go through with it, she screamed, jumping to her feet. I thought it was just a game. I stayed silent. Winston suddenly straightened, puffing out his chest. Listen, pal. I slammed the butt of my gun into his jaw. You're not my pal, you piece of shit. He collapsed, clutching his bleeding mouth. I turned back to Victoria. You want to gamble, Vic? Let's play. She froze, holding her breath. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pair of dice, the same ones I had taken from Harris's burnt-down casino. Your life's on the line, Victoria. Roll them. If you get more than 7, I let you live. If it's less, well, you get the idea. Her eyes filled with terror. Alex, don't roll. Her hands trembled as she took the dice, slowly shook them, then tossed them onto the table. 3. I smirked. Bad bet. I shot her in the knee. She shrieked, crashing to the floor, clutching her bleeding leg. Well, Winston. I turned to him. Your turn. He shook his head wildly, his eyes darting around in panic. Please. Oh, no. You love to play, don't you? Go ahead. I shoved the dice into his hands. He didn't move. I shot him in the leg. Roll the damn dice. He screamed, then frantically tossed them. 4. I pretended to be disappointed. Well, tough luck. I shot his other knee. They writhed in a pool of their own blood. Victoria sobbing, Winston groaning in agony. I crouched beside them. Do you remember what you did? How you thought you could just forget all about it? I leaned in closer. I'm not as merciful as Harris. I don't leave loose ends. I stood and nodded to Joe. Burn it down. With pleasure. I stood by the exit, watching them writhe on the floor, drowning in their own misery. Victoria sobbed, moaning pitifully as she clutched her ruined leg. while Winston convulsed, struggling to grasp the edge of the couch like a fish gasping on the shore. "Alex," Victoria croaked, looking up at me, her face twisted in pain and fear. "Please don't do this," I smiled, like a bartender who had just heard a customer order their favorite drink. "Do what, sweetheart? What are you talking about? I just want you both to enjoy life with a little warmth." Joe burst out laughing behind me. "Oh, damn, that's why I love you." I walked over to the bar, picked up the most expensive bottle of whiskey I could find, twisted the cap off, and slowly poured the golden liquid over Victoria. She shrieked, trying to crawl away, but with a bullet in her knee, she was nothing more than a pathetic, broken thing. "Alex, please," she choked. "We were family." I looked down at her. "You bet our daughter. Families don't do that." I emptied the last of the whiskey over her face and stepped back. Joe was already splashing gasoline over the carpets, the couches, the curtains, whistling a cheerful tune. "Shit, you know what this reminds me of?" he said, grinning at me. "Old family bonfires. Roasting marshmallows, singing songs, except this time, the marshmallows are a couple of assholes." I flicked open a lighter. "Well, Vic, one last lucky roll." She didn't answer. She just sobbed. Winston muttered something incoherent, tried to lift himself onto his elbows. I tossed the lighter. The flames erupted instantly, licking up the expensive drapes, devouring the velvet couches, setting the scattered alcohol ablaze. Winston shrieked as the fire crawled up his pants. He thrashed, trying to beat the flames out with his hands, but that only made it worse. His shirt ignited, the fire swallowing his chest, his throat. "Oh, Winston, what's wrong?" I tilted my head mockingly. "You loved hot girls so much. Now you're one yourself." Joe snorted. "Really? That's your joke? Oh, come on. He's a real hotshot now." I shrugged, watching as his skin blistered. Victoria didn't scream at first. She just lay there, eyes shut, as the fire crawled toward her. "Alex," she whispered, "do you really hate me that much?" I leaned in closer. "I don't feel anything for you anymore." The fire engulfed her. Then she screamed, loud, desperate. I turned and walked out, never looking back. Sirens blared in the distance. "We getting out of here?" Joe asked, flipping the car keys in his hand. "Yeah," I nodded. "I think the show's over." We got in the car and drove off, leaving the villa behind. Now nothing more than a giant torch in the night. I glanced at the rearview mirror and smiled. They placed their bets and lost. 2 years later, I sat on the porch of a small, cozy house by the lake, watching as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the water in warm shades of orange and purple. Nearby, on the wooden dock, Sophia dangled her feet in the water, lazily running her fingers through the ripples. "Dad, did you ever think we'd end up living like this?" she asked without turning around. I smirked, taking a sip of my coffee. "No, sweetheart. I figured by now, I'd either be in prison or feeding the worms." Sophia laughed, but the pain in her voice, the pain that had been there 2 years ago, was gone. She was herself again, calm, confident, happy. We had left the past far behind, bought a home in the middle of nowhere, far from the filth of big cities. Sophia went back to school, took up painting, and hell, she was damn good at it. And me? I tried to start over. I sold everything that tied me to my past, invested in a small private security firm, and for the first time in years, I was beginning to understand what it meant to live without constantly feeling like I was being hunted. And of course, I met her, Elizabeth. She was unlike anyone I had ever known. Strong, independent, a steel spine with a soft smile that made a man like me, a man who had walked through hell, just want to sit beside her and forget about all the bodies left in my wake. We met in the most ordinary way, at a cafe, when I accidentally knocked her coffee over. She didn't just brush it off with a polite, "It's okay." No, she narrowed her eyes at me and said, "You're either blind, clumsy, or trying to hit on someone. What if it's all three? Then you're a disaster." And goddamn, that got me. She was a pediatrician, said she spent her life handling little devils, so dealing with a former soldier wouldn't be a problem. I didn't argue. She was working today, but she'd be back later in the evening. Sophia adored her, and that was all that mattered to me. I looked over at my daughter. "Hey, let's go make dinner before Liz gets here." Oh, right before she calls us culinarily challenge again, Sophia rolled her eyes, standing up. Well, she's not wrong. I chuckled, getting up myself. But, this time I'm going to try not to burn the chicken. Sophia laughed, nudging me playfully, and we headed inside. I knew my past hadn't disappeared. It would always be with me. But now I had the present. And hell, I liked it.